This amazing image, done by a Japanese artist, Kuniyoshi, in the 19th century, is of the yokai, in particular the yokai Gashadokuro. And the yokai is a general sort of class of monsters from Japan. I'm going to talk about those. Sometimes they include ghosts and other animistic spirits. And we're going to learn about this particular skeletal creature and also the larger sort of category of creatures, the yokai, within the context of Asian monsterology and the philosophical underpinnings of Buddhism. This is the drawing that I did based on this particular monster, and then I did a second one here. And here you can see that it's composed of soldiers and dead bodies that have died and remain unburied in the field. Out of revenge, they come together, their ghosts come together and form this yokai creature, which then goes out and seeks revenge in the larger world. So as usual, you're going to see me doing the drawing and also learn about this creature and this sort of class of creatures. The story of the skeletal yokai seeking revenge is based on an actual historical case from the 10th century of a rebel named Masakado who was challenging the emperor. Masakado basically fought and threatened the emperor. He was defeated and was then decapitated, but his daughter, Princess Takayasha, wanted to seek revenge. And so she was living in the house where she grew up with her father when an envoy of emperor's soldiers came to look for other rebels. And she had become a witch, and a very powerful one at that. So she was able to conjure this yokai as a source of revenge. And this Gashadokuro yokai basically is a giant skeleton made from the ghosts of people who died in battle and were not buried. She basically then directed them at the emperor's envoy, and that they struggled, and so that's the sort of legend. Eventually it was defeated, but that's the story of this particular yokai as a sort of source of revenge and vengeance. Basically, there's a larger framework here at work of animism in Japanese culture, as many of you know, and the yokai sort of are would be folded under the larger umbrella of entities that are animistic spirits, and they would be basically the negative ones, the unhelpful or nefarious ones. Kami are the more helpful animistic spirits that you might see in a Hayao Miyazaki film, for example. And all of these are, in a way, part of a metaphysics that is still dominant in Japan, part of the Shinto animistic tradition. And it's believed in some cases very literally, and in other cases it's sort of like it's sort of in between. The Japanese have a kind of a sense of, we believe this somewhat, but also we disbelieve it. And it functions in this interesting gray zone of the imagination where it really is constitutive and actually shapes behavior. For example, there's lots of offerings made, but also it's considered just on the border because, it is a scientific culture as well. So that's an interesting gray zone for us to think about. All right, let's talk about it in the larger framework of death and the idea of memento mori. In Latin, of course, there's this tradition in Christian and ancient pagan thought called Memento Mori, which just means remember your death. And so too in Asian culture, you have the Hungry Ghost Festival is a lot like, you might liken it to the Day of the Dead in Mexican culture, where it's not necessarily negative. We're supposed to remember our dead loved ones. And the hungry ghost and the monsters of the other world are just the worst case scenarios. We also want to just sort of think about death and the impermanence of all things. This is a huge theme in the East because Buddhism, Taoism, they all express the idea that everything is impermanent. There is no such thing as an everlasting, eternal, or permanent reality. It's very common in the East to understand that everything
everything is born, everything dies, everything changes. So here's a couple of images. On the left-hand side, I grabbed an image from the Chinese festival, the Hungry Ghost Festival, and on the right-hand side, the Japanese Bon Festival, which is basically the same festival. In Chinese, Egui is basically a hungry ghost, and it basically means like just means hungry, and Gui is sort of ghost. Actually, it's funny. Gui Lao is a phrase that I heard a lot when I was living in China. It's a way of saying, the Chinese will refer to me, for example, as a Gui Lao. Some people think it's, it's derogatory. I never took it that way, and I don't really care. But it sort of means like white ghost. So you might hear a Chinese person refer to me when I was living in China as a Gui Lao. And it just, it sort of means like foreigner, and somebody who's basically uncivilized and, from the West. It is kind of funny that that's how it emerged. It tends to come out of Cantonese rather than Mandarin, but it's used by everybody on the mainland. The idea in the Hungry Ghost Festival is that you basically bring these surrogate luxury items to the festival, like fake Fendi bags and Gucci clothing, and even stacks of fake money. And then you basically, at this certain time, you burn them all in a bonfire. And the idea is to sort of remember, you're making an offering to the dead, but you're also reminding yourself that none of this stuff matters. It's only being a good person and compassionate and moral righteousness that matters. So it's a way of sort of reminding the culture, don't become like a ghost, a hungry ghost. End up as a good kind of ghost. And so it's designed to remind us of these things. All right, perhaps some of the most compelling imagery and stories about the monsters of the hungry ghosts occur in the Japanese tradition. Here's some images from the Gaki Zoshi scroll made in the 12th century. This is in the National Museum in Tokyo. It's a long scroll in which there are many paintings of hungry ghosts. And you probably can't make this out sufficiently, but if you look at the left-hand image of the slide, you'll see that people are just basically in an open latrine. They're basically just defecating, going to the bathroom. And the white figures, that look human are humans, but you see they're surrounded by these grayed out creatures with big bellies and this crazy hair. Those are essentially invisible, but they're basically surrounding the latrine, and they basically end up eating your excrement. So the story is like they're so miserable and they can't get anything to eat, and they're actually, if they can eat anything, they're forced to eat excrement. So it's a pretty disgusting story, but it's a way of showing you how desperate you might become if you don't take care of your karma. And the same thing here on the right, another image from the Gakizoshi scroll of a really hapless character. And these can, one of the things you're doing in the East is you're trying to assuage these and keep them out of your day-to-day life. And I'm going to show you how people do that, one of the ways that people do that. But I'm just reminding you of the overall structure, the sort of ethics of connected to monsters here, which is basically karma, suffering, and compassion. As you know, the idea of karma is no joke in Asia. It's taken very seriously. I would say people don't think about it as much in China. It's really not part of the operating system, but it's a huge influence in India, in the subcontinent, in Southeast Asia. When I was living in Cambodia, I remember we were working on a research project studying, beliefs like karma, and there was one of my graduate students was doing a thesis, and she was interviewing women who had very sadly contracted AIDS from their husbands. And the way that this happened was the husbands would go to the brothel and they would pick up the disease from the prostitute, and then they would bring it home to their wife, and the wife would contract it. And the shocking thing was that when my student would interview the women, her project was sort of how to try to see how do women understand this, how do they think about it, what can be done about it, how can we improve the situation. And what she found was frequently that the women, the wives, were upset. They were mad at their husbands, of course, and they were sick, but they interpreted it as being the karmic result, the fruits of karma from some previous life that they had lived in which they had sinned greatly. So that's a way in which karma in Asia is taken way more seriously than even sort of the hippie types in California who talk about karma all the time. I mean, we talk about karma and we use it to, in a sort of convenient, sort of karma light, as it were. But in those countries, it's much more serious. It's really part of the metaphysical structure of reality. The idea then is that if you act compassionately, you will avoid the monsters and you will also avoid becoming a monster. This is an image of hungry ghosts in hell, and then that figure on the left who's come down is actually an incarnation of the Buddha named Guanyin. And Guanyin is the Chinese female Buddha, which is a version of the Indian Buddha Avalokitesvara. And here she's just feeding them. She's sprinkling food to them, and they're burning in hell, but she's also trying to give them some relief. So even the monsters deserve some compassion. And that's a fairly common image that you might see in Asia. Let's talk a little bit about the Japanese tradition of the yokai. Yokai are a class of supernatural monsters, spirits and demons from Japanese folklore. The word yokai is made up of kanji for bewitching, attractive, calamity, specter, and so on. You will sometimes see them described as mononoke, and this word and this idea has made its way into 20th and 21st century anime. This is an image there was a lot of woodblock printing done, in the 18th century and into the 19th century, and this woodblock, these books that were made of woodblock prints really codified and clarified what some of these monsters look like. That sort of changed it from being, just a literary description to something that was pictorial, and that sort of shaped the way these things were described in Japanese culture. And then if you look here on the second paragraph, Japanese folklorists and historians explain the yokai as personifications of supernatural or unaccountable phenomena to their informants. In the Edo period, many artists, such as Toriyama Seikin, invented new yokai by taking inspiration from folk tales or purely from their own imagination. So that tradition is rooted in medieval literature, but in modern times it's been a source of all kinds of great imaginative work by artists and writers and so forth. Here's a yokai very famously from the 36 Ghost series, which was done in the 1890s. This is the ground spider, and so oftentimes these images are really fun and are well known in Japan. And there's a huge pantheon of these yokai. I'm not going to get into, describing them in specific, but give you some sort of general, species of yokai, which is the shapeshifters are bakemono or obake. And these are creatures that can take on all kinds of different physical characteristics of other animals, changing from one animal to another, the hybrid mixes of two different animals, or part human, part creature. To just briefly mention the kaiju, because I know a lot of people are interested in the kaiju, and you might think, well, the kaiju, which basically is a giant monster, must go way back in Japanese history, but it really doesn't. It's part of really a 20th century cultural movement where Japanese filmmakers were trying to convey and create characters that would be like King Kong. They were very impressed by the the American Hollywood tradition of giant monsters. King Kong had been made in the 30s, if I'm remembering this correctly, and then people in the 40s started to think, well, let's create our own giant monster because it really sells a lot of tickets and it's a fascinating story. And then, of course, the Japanese created their most famous kaiju, which is Godzilla. As many of you know, Godzilla was originally a very serious film, and it was about, it was sort of right on the heels of the actual dropping of the, of the bomb in Japan. The original Godzilla was a critique of, nuclear technology and the arrogance and hubris of creating world-destroying technologies like the bomb. So in the original Godzilla, it's weaponry that awakes this giant dinosaur creature from the bottom of the ocean, which rises up and then, of course, puts Japan in peril. And many of us have seen, countless Godzilla films. Some of them are god-awful, and some of them are very thought-provoking and powerful. And so here's just two images. One, I don't know what this is on the left. It looks like Destroy All Monsters or something. King Ghidorah there. And then on the right, something much more recent. I think this is a wonderful tradition because it does change depending on when you see the film or the graphic novel or whatever it is. Sometimes the giant monster is just evil and we have to kill it and nuke it or whatever it is. But in other cases, the giant monster is a personification of nature itself and is trying to protect human beings and has a symbiotic relationship with nature. So you see this story being told and cashed out much more in recent films. Godzilla awakens to warn us about our own defilement of the environment, or awakens to set the environment back into harmony with itself. So there's almost like Godzilla is sort of like a personification of Shiva, as we saw earlier in the Hindu tradition. He's going to have to use fire and pain and destruction in order to recalibrate and create, the proper connection of or balance of yin and yang. So these kinds of things occur oftentimes in the kaiju tradition. I want to talk about what's underneath all of these traditions just for a few minutes, and that is animism. What is animism? How does it animate many of these traditions, and how does it fit in with our overall interest in monsterology? Animism is the idea that the nature is filled with spirits, whether they're good or bad. That everywhere you look, the tree has a spirit in it, the river has a spirit in it, the mountain has a spirit in it, the sky has a spirit in it. And the technical term for this is animism. Anima is the Latin word that means soul or spirit. So to say that you believe in animism, basically all forms of paganism are animistic. So if you're into Druid, Irish, pagan traditions of nature, you're an animist. If you believe in spirit beings in Cambodia, you're an animist. Technically, what animism commits to is the idea that there are many kinds of persons in the world, only some of whom are humans. We tend to think in the West that humans are persons, but insects are not, trees are not. In the animistic tradition, everything has a personality, everything has some kind of personal history. And so the essential properties of this are, one, agency attribution. The tree is an agent. The insect is an agent. The sky can make choices, wants things. That's what I mean by agency. And also there's teleology, which means nature itself has purpose built within it. That the tree, this kind of a tree has the purpose of sheltering this kind of a bird. And that's a way of thinking about nature that's animistic and sort of pre-scientific. After science, we don't think of the world as structured in this way as having purposes built into them, because after Darwin, we don't think that nature has purpose built in. It just has stuff that works well, and then that gets selected for and passed on genetically by natural selection. But animism suggests that there is in fact purpose all through nature. So there can be good and bad within nature itself. Here's some examples. Buddhism and Animism is a kind of syncretism. So the official religion could be Buddhist, but below that is animism, alive and well, and the two merge together, and you find that religions in Asia are oftentimes syncretic in this way. They're mixes of different spiritual traditions. You don't have to choose one rather than another. You can be both simultaneously. So in Cambodia, there are these spirit creatures called Nekta. In Burma, there's the Nats. In Thailand, there's the Pi. In Laos, there's the Pi and the Bachi. In Japan, the Kami. In Vietnam, the Vat Linh. And in China, Shenism or Shenjiao. These are all spirit beings. And these traditional cultures still pray to these beings. There's still plenty of offerings. If you go to a Thai restaurant, you'll see an altar for a spirit being. And every morning when you get to work, the owner will make offerings to the spirit being. If you go to a Chinese restaurant, there'll be guangong, there'll be a shrine, and you make offerings of fruit and incense and so forth. So this stuff is alive and well. This is not ancient history. And in Japanese culture, the tradition is Shintoism. That's the animistic tradition. So here in Japanese animism, the kami is the way that is a way of describing spirits generally. And so I just grabbed some imagery from Hayao Miyazaki films, and you'll see that in his films, the kami are very much central protagonists and characters in the storyline. And he sort of dramatizes some of this for the sake of, for the sake of the films, but generally speaking, Japanese culture embraces the idea that below their Buddhist convictions is a sort of spirit realm, and that these things exist and we have access to them pretty much all the time. Now, people have had different theories about animism. Some of them have been fairly condescending. It shouldn't be a surprise to you that Western intellectuals look down their noses at animism. They think, well, this is primitive stuff. So here's some quotes that give you a sense of this. I actually think David Hume's claim is not quite as condescending as some of the others, but Hume says, quote, "There is a universal tendency among mankind to conceive all beings like themselves and to transfer to every object those qualities with which they are familiarly acquainted and of which they are intimately conscious." So here he's just saying, look, human beings tend to project themselves out into nature. I know what, my mother, my brother, my father are like. They have these personalities, they have wants and hopes and dreams and fears, and they behave in certain ways. So since I don't really understand how trees work and how rivers work, I'm going to extrapolate my understanding of human personality into nature. Then Wilhelm Wundt writes, "Animism may be looked upon as the spiritual expression of man's natural state, insofar as this is at all accessible to our observation." So Wundt is saying animism is probably like how our ancestors, the first Homo sapiens, related to nature. It's probably what the original religion was like. It captures both our fears and our hopes and our way of understanding nature. And then Freud says, quote, "Spirits and demons were nothing but the projection of primitive man's emotional impulses. He personified the things he endowed with effects, populated the world with them, and then rediscovered his inner psychic processes outside himself." So what Freud is saying is we project our personalities out into nature, and then we erase that projection. We forget that we did that. We suppress or repress that, and instead we now think we're finding personality in the trees and the rivers. Now, I don't take a position on whether this is correct or not. I'm simply trying to convey to you what the psychodynamics might be of animism. So if in the same way that you think there's, monsters in the woods, you might just be projecting your own fears about other, not just predators, but other human beings out into the nature itself. I want to point out that there's an interesting way of thinking about this that shows that it's not just primitive. I find that a little bit condescending, because I think we too, even if we have scientific literacy, we tend to think in animistic terms. We still do. Doesn't matter how scientifically sophisticated you are, we still tend to think that nature has personality and that maybe there are spirits around. So vertical model of cognitive prediction processors, where the early brain is sort of reptilian. You see it in white here. Wrapped around that is the limbic brain, which is the emotional brain, and wrapped around that is the neocortex. And I want to suggest to you that the scientific cognition, where we see the world in terms of its scientific theories, where there are no spirit beings, there are no monsters, there are no gods, there's just sort of experimental method, hypothesis, and the world is basically material. That makes sense to the neocortex. And I'm trying to suggest to you that the older parts of the brain are much more pre-axial, animistic cognition. What does that mean? I mean sort of before the rise of science and even before the rise of monotheism. That's what it means to be pre-axial. There is a kind of animistic way of thinking about nature. And so you'll see this in Native American religion. You'll see this in people who live in very close communion with nature all the time. They think about nature as a personality, not as just a thing to be manipulated and mastered. And so I do think that these are two different ways of thinking about the world that are not necessarily opposed, but could be perhaps stacked together in a syncretic fashion. Something for you to think about in the future. One last point here, and then we'll wrap up, is that many of the gods of the East and many of the sort of demons and monsters of the East are going to be handled by shaman of some form or another. So there's a priest class that their job is essentially to go to the other realm or to contact the co-present dimension and help you modify it and get good luck and get good karma and avoid bad things. So a priest class, in Buddhist countries, oftentimes this falls to Buddhist monks, but their job is to help you make the right rituals and sacrifices so that the spirits will leave you alone. My friend in Laos, I remember him telling me that on the full moon, he needed to put out special sacrifices to the spirit houses that he had in his backyard. That's where he had tried to coax the spirits to live in these spirit houses, and he put like shot glasses of vodka out and lotus leaves and lotus plants and so forth. And this was a way of keeping the spirits in this house so that they wouldn't go into his house and get into the dreams of his children and give them nightmares. So that was his belief, and so that's how he was handling the sort of monster spirits that were all around. These creatures oftentimes have the category violations that we've talked about before. They're mixtures of other creatures, and they therefore spark arousal, attention, and they create bonds. And this is one of the arguments we've made before, which is oftentimes the monster traditions are about creating sticky memes, because sticky memes create social solidarity, because we gather around them, we tell stories about them, we create rituals around them. It's a way of transmitting ideas that then make us a people, and the people with those other memes are a different kind of people. So that's part of the us-them tribalism of traditional indigenous cultures. All right. That's a lot on Asian monsters, and obviously we've just scratched the surface, but I think you'll get a sense of the general lay of the land. Okay, see you next time.